Session 6. Brunch Trip. The morning after the concert, Troll Skull Manor was unusually quiet. Most of the Skull Patrol remained asleep, recovering from the previous night's music, intrigue, and unexpected heroics. But Floon and the Wen Wolf awoke early, before the rest of the house had begun to stir. They met in the sitting area on the second floor, where they began discussing what they might do with the day ahead. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock from downstairs. The two looked at one another. Visitors to Troll Skull Manor were becoming increasingly common, but visitors at this hour were another matter entirely. After briefly debating whether answering the door was wise or even necessary, they crept toward a window and peered down into the street. Standing outside was Master Nessa Brindle of the Carpenters, Roofers and Plasterers Guild. She held a thick stack of papers beneath one arm while tapping one foot impatiently against the cobblestones. Floon and the Wen Wolf relaxed. Slightly. Unless the guild had adopted an unusually aggressive approach to collecting new clients, she probably meant them no harm. They hurried downstairs and opened the door. Master Brindle entered with her usual dry but not entirely unfriendly efficiency. She wasted little time on pleasantries before presenting them with a detailed, carefully itemized assessment of Troll Skull Manor's many deficiencies. There were damaged floors, unsafe walls, broken windows, failing plaster, neglected woodwork, a leaking roof, and an impressive assortment of other problems that apparently separated an abandoned haunted tavern from a respectable public establishment. At the bottom of the final page was the grand total: 1,000 gold dragons. It was not an unimaginable amount of money. Troll Skull Manor was a large building, after all, and the Skull Patrol had already encountered people in Waterdeep who dealt in far greater sums. Still, 1,000 dragons was considerably more money than either Floon or the Wen Wolf had ever personally possessed at one time. They thanked Master Brindle, accepted the estimate, and watched her depart before looking once more at the total. Renovating Troll Skull Manor was possible. It was simply not possible yet. The matter of breakfast, however, was much more immediate. Volo and his mysterious ability to produce elaborate morning meals were nowhere to be found. With no sign that anyone else in the house would awaken soon, Floon and the Wen Wolf decided to venture into the North Ward in search of something to eat. They had barely stepped outside before noticing that Froom's Brews, directly across the street, was already open. A chalkboard sign had been placed proudly on the sidewalk, now serving breakfast. The timing seemed almost suspiciously convenient. Still, it was nearby, it was open, and neither of them had eaten. Floon and the Wen Wolf crossed the street and stepped into Froom's Brews. Emmett Floon greeted them almost immediately. He remembered them from the previous evening and welcomed them with the eager friendliness of a man who had opened a competing tavern directly across from their property and very much wanted them to know how well it was going. As they exchanged small talk, Floon noticed the rotating selection of ales written proudly across the chalkboard behind the bar. There was Blackstaff Bitter, a dark and aggressively hopped ale that left the tongue slightly numb. There was Moon Maiden Pale, brewed with white flowers and citrus peel. There was Dockhand's Mercy, a strong amber ale whose name became increasingly relevant with every swallow. There was Eel Street Porter, thick, black, and served with a tiny pickled onion. There was Griffin's Landing Red, which Floon insisted finished like controlled descent. And Honey Undercliff Orchard Saison. There was even Troll Skull Brown, which Emick loudly maintained had been named long before the neighboring tavern changed ownership. But at the very top of the board, written larger and more proudly than all the rest, was the most expensive and intriguing selection. Dragon Shroom Piss, Special Edition Candle Lane Brewery Earthy Mushroom Ale with a sharp mineral finish and unpredictable complexity. 8 copper. Floon studied the board. So, he asked, turning toward Floon, were you serious about the first round being on you? Floon glanced toward the morning light outside. Well, it is just daybreak, he admitted, but I suppose it's never too early for a fine ale at Floon's Brews. Sure, why not? First round is on me. Oh, said the Wen Wolf. In that case, I'll have one too. That's settled then, Floon said. What'll you two have? Perhaps Floon chose the Dragonshroom Piss because it was the most expensive drink available. Perhaps the phrase unpredictable complexity appealed to him. Perhaps he simply could not allow something with such a revolting name to remain a mystery. "I'll have the dragon shroom piss," he announced. "That's what I'll have as well," said the Wen Wolf. Floon's expression brightened. "2 dragon shroom piss special editions coming right up. You two are in for quite the experience. We only got this one in last night, and the brew has already been causing quite a stir." That might have been the moment to reconsider. Floon placed a pint before each of them. The liquid was earthy and purplish, with a smell that suggested damp soil, mushrooms, and decisions best made after sunset. Floon and the Wen Wolf drank with enthusiasm. They ordered breakfast. As they waited, Floon noticed a sign posted behind the bar. "Help wanted." He asked Floon about it. Emick explained that he was currently running the entire tavern by himself. He took the orders, poured the drinks, prepared the food, cleaned the tables, managed the cellar, and handled every other task required to keep Floon's brews functioning. It was not sustainable. He needed help, but good help was difficult to find. The idea immediately intrigued Floon. Trollskull Manor required 1,000 dragons in repairs, and here was a potential source of income directly across the street. Gain experience in the tavern business, and perhaps even learn something useful for the Skull Patrol's own establishment. Floon applied for the position. Floon responded by producing a surprisingly detailed employment contract. He invited Floon to review it carefully and return it whenever he was ready. Floon accepted the document. Then the dragon shroom piss began to live up to its description. The Wen Wolf turned toward Floon. Something was wrong. Floon appeared to be 12 feet tall. Either that, or the Wen Wolf had become very small. From his position on the bar stool, it was difficult to determine which explanation was correct. The floor seemed unusually distant, the furniture had become strangely proportioned, and every attempt to judge the size of the room produced a different answer. One thing was certain. The Wen Wolf's understanding of physical space was no longer what it had been a few moments earlier. Floon's experience was entirely different. The walls of Floon's brews were suddenly filled with windows. He did not remember seeing them before, but there they were. They looked perfectly natural. Obviously, they had always been there. Floon simply must not have noticed them. We threnched an enchanted forest. Ancient trees rose into a glittering canopy while tiny lights drifted among the branches. Fey creatures moved between enormous flowers, and distant shapes danced beneath leaves painted in impossible colors. Yet the wonders outside were nothing compared to the sounds coming from behind the cellar door. Music, laughter, glasses clinking. A lively and unmistakably magnificent party was taking place below Floon's brews. Floon had attended many parties in his life. Some had been held in taverns, others in theaters. Noble estates, private chambers, and places whose owners had never technically invited him. He had never knowingly ignored a good party. Floon rose from his stool and crossed the taproom toward the cellar. A sign on the door read, "Employees only." "Ahem," said Floon. Floon reached for the door. "I'm quite sorry," Floon continued, "and while I appreciate your enthusiasm, I'm afraid the cellar is off-limits to customers. You see the sign there? Employees only." Floon appeared not to hear him. Floon watched with growing confusion as his customer and prospective employee continued toward the door as though being summoned by something only he could perceive. "Well," Floon said at last, reconsidering, "I suppose if you are seriously considering employment here, it would only be fair to show you around behind the scenes." He stepped around the bar. "Why not?" Together, Floon and Emick Floon descended into the cellar. Floon saw a damp, dirty, moldy room cluttered with barrels, crates, broken furniture, and miscellaneous tavern supplies. The cellar was poorly organized and badly in need of cleaning. Floon saw a grand ballroom. Mice and rats dressed in magnificent finery swept across the floor in an elaborate waltz. Tiny jeweled gowns shimmered beneath chandeliers. Rats in embroidered coats bowed to one another, while cockroaches in immaculate tuxedos carried silver platters of hors d'oeuvres through the crowd. Music seemed to pour from the walls themselves. Floon stared in wonder. "This," he whispered, "this is really something." Floon looked around at the damp walls, scattered boxes, and visible patches of mold. Yes, I know, he said quickly. It's a mess down here. That's much of why I'm trying to hire help. I can't get this place in order and run the bar at the same time. It's all rather turned to chaos. Floon watched a cockroach offer him a tiny pastry. Floon, increasingly uncomfortable with the inspection, placed one hand on Floon's shoulder and guided him toward the stairs. Come now. Let's head back up. I can't leave the bar unattended. When Floon returned to the taproom, the enchanted forest still stretched beyond the windows. A dragonborn patron now sat at the bar holding an unusual stein. An animated human face moved across the mug's surface, and a yellowish-orange light circled its rim in a steady pattern. The wen wolf was nowhere to be seen, or at least, nowhere Floon's altered senses could identify. "What now, Alexa?" the dragonborn asked. The stein's glowing rim brightened. "Here's a weather update for Waterdeep." The mug proceeded to deliver a thorough account of the day's expected temperature, cloud cover, wind conditions, and chance of precipitation. Then, without being asked, it repeated the entire forecast in Elvish. Floon was amazed. He spoke Elvish, and the enchanted stein appeared to possess an astonishing amount of common knowledge. He began asking Alexa questions about Waterdeep, the weather, the surrounding streets, and a wide variety of other mundane subjects. The answers were often technically correct, although coaxing the desired information from the stein required Floon to phrase each question with extraordinary precision. Under normal circumstances, he might have continued speaking with Alexa for hours. These were not normal circumstances. Outside the tavern windows, the enchanted forest beckoned. Floon thanked the stein, abandoned his breakfast, and walked out of Floon's brews in search of adventure. The North Ward had been transformed. Vines curled around lampposts. Flowers whispered from window boxes. Alleyways became woodland paths. Passing Waterdavians appeared as strange and colorful fey creatures engaged in errands of great magical importance. Floon wandered from wonder to wonder, following lights that vanished whenever he approached and turning corners in pursuit of music no one else seemed to hear. Gradually, however, the magic began to fade. Ancient trees became ordinary buildings. Glittering streams became gutters. Fey creatures became confused pedestrians. At last, Floon stopped and looked around. It was midday. He was several blocks from Trollskull Manor, standing beside a canal while a group of children pointed at him curiously. Floon had no clear memory of how he had arrived there. He reached into his clothing and discovered that he was still carrying the contract from Floon's brews. For a moment, Floon studied it. Then he looked back toward the distant streets of the North Ward. Perhaps, he thought, it was time to consider getting a regular job.